Good morning, friend. Or perhaps good evening where you are. Either way, settle in comfortably, because this story isn't just about memory. It's about life, love of routine, and the quiet power of daily choices. At the age of 62, George Whitley stood in his kitchen, staring at a half-eaten bowl of oatmeal. He had sprinkled it with blueberries, as always, but something was off. He couldn't remember if he'd taken his morning vitamins. Or where he'd placed the crossword book he'd started the night before. A small thing, but it tugged at him. That morning, George sat by the window of his modest home in Maple Hollow, a sleepy town known for its calm mornings and nosy squirrels. As he watched the breeze tickle the leaves of his Japanese maple, a realization crept in: his memory, once sharp as a tack, had begun to fray at the edges. "I'm not losing my mind," he mumbled, then chuckled to himself. "Just misplacing parts of it." George had always been a man of structure. A former librarian with an eye for details and a deep love of word games, he knew books and order like the back of his hand. But now he needed something more. A new plan. A new purpose. Something to keep his memory garden blooming. So that afternoon, George pulled out a yellow notepad, the same kind he'd used at the library for decades. And on the first page, he wrote in block letters, Operation Sharp Mind. He underlined it twice. Boldly. With a pen that squeaked slightly from age. He would begin with 3 pillars: eating for brain health, exercising the mind through puzzles, and building a steady, joyful routine. He didn't want to fade slowly into forgetfulness, not while there was still jazz to listen to, books to read, and stories to tell. What George didn't know was how deeply this new mission would change not just his memory, but his entire way of living. George wasn't the kind of man to dive into a fad diet or chase miracle cures. No, he believed in logic. Evidence. A touch of common sense. So when he set out to sharpen his memory, the first step was the kitchen. He sat at the table with his yellow notepad, glasses low on his nose, and wrote "brain food" at the top of the page. Underneath, he scribbled a question: what does the brain actually like to eat? Later that day, George marched into the town library, his old workplace, and asked the current librarian, a cheerful woman named Nina, to help him find books on brain health. "Ah," she said with a smile, "planning to outsmart Father Time?" "You bet I am," George replied. From those books and a few quiet hours of reading, George pieced together a list of foods that would become the backbone of his new lifestyle: blueberries, walnuts, spinach, salmon, dark chocolate, in moderation, and green tea. He even added turmeric, though he admitted the taste would take some getting used to. The next morning, he rolled up his sleeves and went grocery shopping. His cart looked different now: less white bread, more leafy greens. He picked up avocados, olive oil, and a pack of sardines he wasn't yet brave enough to try. Back at home, George stood in his kitchen and cooked himself a proper memory meal: grilled salmon with lemon and herbs, a spinach salad with walnuts and blueberries, and a cup of green tea. As he ate, he felt good, focused, even proud. He stuck a note on the fridge that read, "Eat like you love your brain." From then on, every meal became a quiet declaration of care, not just for his body, but for his future self. Still, George knew food alone wouldn't do the trick. His brain needed more than fuel. It needed to be stretched, challenged, kept curious. And so, the next chapter of Operation Sharp Mind would begin with something George had always adored: puzzles. George always had a soft spot for puzzles. As a boy, he would spend rainy afternoons flipping through dog-eared crossword books while his brothers played outside. Later, as a librarian, he'd sneak in a Sudoku or two during quiet hours. But now, puzzles weren't just fun, they were part of the mission. With his yellow notepad in hand, George wrote a new heading: mental workouts. Below it, he listed everything he could think of: crosswords, jigsaw puzzles, Sudoku, memory games, riddles, and chess. He began simply: one puzzle a day. Every morning, after his brain breakfast, he'd sit in his favorite armchair by the window and tackle a crossword puzzle. At first, it took him longer than it used to. He found himself pausing mid-clue, the answer dancing just out of reach. But rather than get frustrated, George smiled. That's the point, he reminded himself. Work the muscle. Soon, his routine expanded. Tuesdays were for Sudoku. Thursdays, he visited a puzzle website Nina had shown him. Sundays became jigsaw day. He'd lay out pieces across his dining table, fitting each one into place like building blocks for a better memory. One afternoon, he challenged himself with something new, memorizing short lists. Groceries. Capitals. Bird species. He tested himself before bed, recalling each item in order. The process, though simple, made his mind feel alive. Word spread in Maple Hollow. Some neighbors teased him, George and his brain boot camp. But others got curious. Mrs. Duval from across the street started joining him for chess on Wednesday mornings. Her skills were rusty, but her laughter was sharp. "Checkmate," she said one week, grinning. On purpose, George lied with a wink. As the weeks passed, George noticed subtle shifts. He recalled names faster. He remembered where he'd placed his reading glasses. Even old memories from childhood came back clearer, like someone had wiped the dust off the shelves in his mind. Still, George understood that feeding the brain and exercising it weren't enough without one more thing: structure. And so, Operation Sharp Mind moved into its next phase, the power of routine. There was something comforting about the way morning light spilled into George's kitchen, always from the same corner of the window, always with a soft golden hue. At 62, George had begun to appreciate these small consistencies more than ever. They weren't just familiar, they were powerful. He had read, during his research, that the brain loves patterns. Routine, it seemed, wasn't just for toddlers or busy executives. It was a secret weapon for clarity, energy, and, most importantly for George, memory. So, he created what he called the gentle schedule. It wasn't rigid, like the agendas he'd seen in retirement homes. No hourly alarms, no military-style drills. Just a soft, steady rhythm to his day, predictable, meaningful, and easy to follow. Mornings were sacred. George would wake around 7 a.m. Not too early, not too late. He'd sit up slowly, stretch his arms, and whisper the same thing each day. "Let's give the brain a good day." He'd shuffle into the kitchen, brew a pot of green tea, and start breakfast, usually oatmeal with blueberries and walnuts, or scrambled eggs with spinach and a side of whole grain toast. His body knew the menu now, and so did his mind. That familiarity gave him space to think, reflect, and start his day with calm. By 8 a.m., George was at his crossword, pen in hand, brain engaged. Sometimes, he'd hum quietly as he worked, like a man tuning a machine. The puzzle wasn't just an exercise, it was a checkpoint. How quickly do the words come today? Did I get stuck on that same clue as last week? After his puzzle, George would go for a short walk. Just around the block most days. But on Saturdays, he'd walk through the old town square, passing the bakery, the antique shop, and the small park with the duck pond. The fresh air, he'd read, was good for circulation. But more than that, the routine of moving his body gave his thoughts a place to roam, stretch, and settle. By late morning, George would settle in for what he called his deep dive. This was the part of the day he dedicated to learning something new. He rotated between reading books about world history, watching documentaries on space, and occasionally trying out a foreign language app on his tablet. His French wasn't great, but he could now confidently order cheese and ask for the bathroom in Paris, which, to him, felt like progress. Lunch came at 12:30, usually light, a bowl of lentil soup, or a turkey sandwich with avocado and a side of fruit. And always, always a glass of water. Hydration, he had learned, was a quiet friend of good memory. Afternoons were for creativity. George had taken up journaling, not with the goal of becoming a writer, but simply to keep the gears turning. He wrote about the weather, about memories from his childhood, or little stories he made up about the squirrels in his yard. Some days, he'd sketch in a notebook. Badly, but joyfully. "Your squirrel looks like a cat," Mrs. Duval teased once. "It's a very confident squirrel," George replied with a grin. By 4 p.m., he'd make a cup of tea and review his yellow notepad. He kept daily notes now, small check-ins on how his memory felt, how focused he'd been, or what he'd like to improve. These weren't judgmental notes. Just gentle observations. A way to chart the path. Dinner was always around 6 p.m. George made it an event, even if he was eating alone. No television. No phone. Just the meal, some soft jazz in the background, and a candle. He said it made the food taste better. And maybe, in a way, it made the day feel more complete. Evenings were for wind down. At 7 p.m., he'd call someone, his niece in Chicago, an old friend from his librarian days, or even Mrs. Duval if she was free. Conversation, he believed, was one of the best brain exercises out there. No app or book could replace the back and forth of real human exchange. Then, by 8 o'clock, it was time for one last puzzle. Something light. A riddle or a simple word game. And finally, at 9 p.m., he'd read a chapter from a novel before bed, usually historical fiction or mystery, genres that tickled his curiosity without overwhelming it. Lights out by 9:30. Always. Now, there were days when things didn't go exactly to plan. Some mornings started later. Some afternoons were slower. But the bones of his routine stayed intact, and that was the magic of it. The routine gave his brain anchors. It gave each day a beginning, middle, and end. After about a month of this rhythm, George noticed something beautiful. He was no longer trying to remember things. He just did. He remembered where he put his reading glasses. He could name every neighbor on his street. He recalled old library codes, dates from high school history, and even the first song he danced to at his wedding over 30 years ago. More than that, his days felt full. Not busy, but full. With purpose. With clarity. With peace. Routine hadn't trapped George, it had freed him. And yet, he knew this was just the beginning. Because the final piece of his memory mission wasn't about food or puzzles or schedules. It was about people. Connection. Community. Because the brain, like a garden, didn't just need sunlight and water, it needed other voices, other hands, other hearts. There's something quiet and powerful about a shared laugh, especially in the later seasons of life. George had always enjoyed solitude, but as his days settled into their thoughtful rhythm, he began to realize something else. Memory was not a journey to be taken alone. It was a crisp Thursday morning in early fall when this truth came knocking. Literally. Knock knock. George opened the door to find Mrs. Duval standing there, arms folded, lips twitching into a smile. She was in her late 60s, wore bold red glasses, and never apologized for speaking her mind. "I brought cinnamon bread," she said, holding out a warm loaf wrapped in a dish towel. "And a chessboard. Thought it was time I gave you a proper rematch." George laughed. "You just want to prove last week wasn't luck." "It wasn't," she said, pushing past him into the kitchen. And just like that, Thursdays became game day. What began as casual matches turned into something more, a tradition. They played at George's kitchen table, always with tea, always with the soft jazz station humming in the background. But more than the game, it was the conversation that mattered. They'd talk about everything, their families, old stories from childhood, books they'd read, even the best way to pickle onions. "I read somewhere," Mrs. Duval said one afternoon, "that socializing is like fertilizer for the brain. keeps things blooming. George smiled. Then we're practically gardeners. It was true. Science backed it, of course. He'd read that staying socially connected could slow cognitive decline, boost mood, even protect against memory loss. But George didn't need a study to feel the difference. After an hour of laughter and dialogue, his mind felt sharper. Brighter. One day, while packing up the chessboard, Mrs. Duval said, "You know what we should do? Start a club." A club? Yeah. Not like those dull ones where people read quietly and fall asleep. Something with life. Games. Stories. Food. Something to keep folks thinking, and talking. George raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" As a heart attack, she grinned. "Well, not that serious. But yes, I am." So, they did. With a few flyers pinned to the library bulletin board and a handful of phone calls to old acquaintances, the Mind and Mingle Club was born. They met every Tuesday afternoon at the community center, just 10 people at first, aged 60 and up. Some had sharp minds, some not so much. But all were eager to connect. Each week had a theme: memory games, storytelling, trivia, even improv skits. Someone brought a deck of cards. Another shared homemade soup. And George? He brought his yellow notepad and a warm welcome. It wasn't about perfection or performance. It was about participation. And presence. One woman, Elsie, told stories so detailed it was like stepping into the past. "When I was 12, she said once, I memorized the entire train schedule between here and Boston. My father worked the rails." Her eyes sparkled with the memory. "I can still see the platform in my head." Another member, Tom, had early-stage dementia. He couldn't always follow the games, but he lit up during sing-alongs. He remembered every word to old jazz standards, and his voice, deep and worn, filled the room like a favorite record. George found that these moments were more powerful than any puzzle. The brain, he realized, wasn't just a machine to be oiled and maintained. It was a place of connection. A bridge to others. And keeping it sharp wasn't only about remembering facts, it was about staying present, staying in life. One afternoon, after the club had wrapped up and everyone had gone home, George lingered by the window of the community center. The sun was beginning to set, casting long amber shadows across the floor. He felt something stir in his chest, not sadness, not joy, but a gentle, settling peace. He remembered something his father had told him once, years ago: the mind is like a fire, son. It burns better when it's shared. And that's exactly what this was. A shared flame. Everyone contributing a spark, a word, a smile. And in return, everyone's memory burned just a little brighter. Back at home, George added a new section to his notepad: people. He listed names, new friends, old neighbors, folks from the club. Not because he was afraid he'd forget, but because he wanted to remember them on purpose. To honor their stories. To keep them close. His days now felt fuller than ever. He still followed his routine, still ate his brain food, solved his puzzles, walked his daily loop, but now, each day had texture. Conversations. Laughter. The occasional off-key group sing-along. Memory, George had discovered, wasn't just about what the brain held. It was about what the heart kept. And as the club grew, as more people joined and more stories were told, George realized something else: he wasn't just preserving his memory. He was creating new ones. By the time winter settled over Maple Hollow, George had fallen into a steady, fulfilling groove. His brain felt alive, fed by good food, challenged by puzzles, anchored by routine, and nourished by friendships. But one snowy morning, while flipping through a magazine at the library, George read a curious sentence: "Your brain can grow new neurons, even after 60. He blinked. New neurons, he whispered aloud. The article explained the concept of neuroplasticity. The idea that the brain, far from being fixed, could actually change. Grow. Rewire. Even create new connections when challenged in the right way. George was fascinated. He dove deeper. It turned out, one of the best ways to encourage this growth was by learning something completely unfamiliar. So George tried painting. Then pottery. He bought a harmonica and began teaching himself to play. His fingers fumbled, and his timing was questionable, but it made him laugh, and it made him think. His brain, once a comfortable old bookshelf, had become a messy, wonderful lab of experimentation. Each time he tried something new, he could feel it, like his mind was stretching, expanding. And though not every attempt was a success, he gave up on salsa dancing after 2 classes. The very act of trying was what mattered. It wasn't about mastery. It was about movement. And George's mind was moving. Not every day was perfect. There were mornings when George felt cloudy. Not sad, not sick, just foggy. Like his thoughts were moving through syrup. He'd forget a word mid-sentence. Walk into a room and forget why. Misplace his notepad. At first, he panicked. Is it starting? He'd wonder. Am I losing it after all? But then he remembered something else he'd read during his research: everyone has foggy days. They don't define your memory, they remind you to slow down. So he adjusted. On foggy days, George lightened his routine. He'd take a longer walk. Skip the harder puzzles. Listen to music instead of trying to learn something new. He'd be gentle with himself. And sure enough, the clouds always lifted. Mrs. Duval called it brain weather. Some days it's clear skies, she said, and some days it's cloudy. But the sun's still there, just hidden behind a thought or two. George learned not to fear the fog. It came and went. But the habits he'd built, those stayed. Like lighthouse beams in the mist. As spring arrived, George started a new project. He called it the memory box. It was a simple wooden box he found at a thrift store, painted a warm shade of navy. Inside, he placed small items that sparked strong memories: a photo of his parents, a ticket stub from his favorite concert in 1978, a letter from his late wife, a pine cone from his childhood home. Every Saturday, he'd take out one item and write about it in his journal. He'd let the memory unfold: where he was, how he felt, what it meant. The process was surprisingly powerful. Old memories, long buried, came back in vivid color. Some brought tears. Others laughter. But each one reminded George that his mind was a story, not a storage unit. He began encouraging his club to make their own memory boxes. Soon, everyone had one. They'd bring them to the group, share stories, and watch how objects became bridges between the past and the present. And something unexpected happened: the more George revisited old memories, the more room he felt he had for new ones. By late spring, George had become something of a memory mentor. People in town began stopping him at the bakery or on his walks. "You're the brain guy, right?" they'd say with a smile. "What's the best food for focus?" or "How do you stay so sharp?" He never claimed to be an expert, but he shared what he knew with joy. Soon, the local community center asked him to give a talk, "Growing Your Mind After 60." George stood nervously at the front of the room, his yellow notepad in hand, and began with the same phrase he used to whisper each morning. "Let's give the brain a good day." He spoke from the heart, about blueberries and green tea, puzzles and walks, the joy of trying something new, and the magic of connecting with others. People listened. Took notes. Asked questions. Some cried. And George realized something that caught him by surprise: he wasn't just keeping his own memory alive. He was helping others grow theirs. George was 70 when the community center dedicated a small garden in his honor. It wasn't grand, just a patch of raised beds with lavender, rosemary, and a bench shaded by a young maple tree. But there was a sign at the entrance that read, "The Mind Garden, in celebration of lifelong learning and living." George sat there often, notebook in hand, harmonica in his pocket, and a smile on his face. The club still met every Tuesday. The squirrels still played in his yard. The crossword still waited for him every morning. His memory? Not perfect. But sharp enough. Rich. Alive. And more importantly, it was his. Because George had learned the truth about memory. It doesn't just live in your brain. It lives in your routine. Your relationships. Your curiosity. Your stories. And with care, with purpose, and with heart, it can grow at any age. The end.